All right. So, DOM manipulation part two. We are going to be talking about DOM today, not this kind of DOM, but this kind of DOM. The type of DOM we're covering today is the same one you went over just a few days ago. DOM, or the document object model, is a hierarchical model of the objects contained in an HTML document. So when you're writing text, a text document, like in Microsoft Word, for example, it's usually structured with the header, a body, a footer. You can add tables, charts, and images wherever you like, but you can't see what any of these objects look like behind the screen. HTML files contain a very similar structure, and DOM is simply explicitly naming the elements of and within the structure. So everything from the type of document to the type of content you want the user to see will have a corresponding name. In a sense, DOM is just a programming interface for web documents. It's really just parsed HTML, and it organizes the objects of a document into a model. So a side-by-side view of what these objects might look like in HTML and how they're structured in a DOM. You could see it's, like we've already said a few times, very hierarchical. In the code, we have our indentations to show us how these elements are nested within one another. You have opening tags followed by closing tags. In a graph representation of this, it's essentially like a tree. You start with the overhead document, and from there you branch off into the subcomponents or the elements that are being rendered on the screen. So let's dive into the exercise where we're going to see how we can render these elements both in HTML with CSS styling and in JavaScript. I'm just going to share the entire window now just so we could switch back and forth easily between VS Code and our document. So here we have our document. If we look at the HTML, and let me make this a little bigger, we could see that our HTML document consists of some tags. Here we have HTML with language set to English. And then we have an opening head tag where we pass in some meta parameters. Meta parameters are basically metadata that's relevant to the HTML document, but not exactly data that's going to be rendered as an element. Some things you'll be able to see in the browser, like if we look at let's see. Yeah, if we look at title, for example, we could see that the title of our document is just document. If we were to change this to something like, I don't know, DOM exercise, and we refresh, it updates our header in the tab of our browser. Here we have a body element that we're creating. We create an H1 element, which H1 through H6 are basically different header sizes. And then we have a series of divs. The first div having an ID of container, and the subsequent divs having class set to items. You may already know from yesterday that class and ID are utilized by CSS styling. So when we look at our cascading style sheet, we could see that we have items corresponding to these classes. Everything's commented out for now, but just keep that in mind. So here we see every element, every div, the header included, is rendered in our HTML documents. If we are to add some styling, let's first enable this first block here. What we're doing is we're specifying a container, and we're specifying a display in a grid-like array. And we're setting the number of columns and rows to consist of 5 each. If we look back at our HTML, we can see that, let's see, container is referenced in the element, and it is referenced here as well. So this hashtag is basically used to refer to an ID, whereas dot notation is used to reference a class. So if we look at items, for example, or dot items, I should say, where did this start? So let me refresh. We could see that the items are being updated to match the style that we've specified. We could also do things like add this :hover to specify that we want to add some styling when we hover over an individual item. So in this case, we're adding a new color, blue-violet, and we're adding an animation. Animations in CSS are controlled using keyframes. So here we're saying keyframes called twist. Twist is then being called in this animation line here. We specify a duration of 2 seconds. We have a transformation from rotation of 0 degrees to 360 degrees. Pretty straightforward. Let's try playing around with some of these parameters. Let's set this at 720. Looks like it's doing the same thing. Let's set it to 180 instead. Oh, I got to refresh, right? Cool. It's a lot slower. And it's only rotating 180 degrees. Notice how that 25 is upside down before it goes right side up. Well, let's actually change to 721 to see if it increases the speed. And we see within that 2-second time frame, it rotates 360 degrees twice. Let's go back to our index.html. Let's comment all of this out, and let's see what this looks like utilizing JavaScript instead. So we just removed all of this, and we're going to add this again, but instead of having any elements defined inside of our HTML, we are now calling a script called app.js or app.js. And if we refresh, we see that we have a welcome page, because if we look inside of our app.js, we have our welcome page rated as text content. So what's happening here is on load, once this document loads, we are defining some parameters. We're defining a body, and we're defining a header, and we're defining the text content of that header to be welcome page. And then we append h1 to body as a child. Any questions about this so far?
What's a query selector do?
Query selector will select the element that is going to be represented in the DOM. So let body is the variable that we're using to essentially cache this body element in the DOM. Does that make sense?
Yep, got it.
Cool. All right, let's take a look at what else we can add to this code. So let's say we want to, actually, I skipped something real quick. I just want to replace all of this with console.log. And if we refresh, we could see that we have our console statement. So one cool thing about your I'm blanking on what this thing is called, your little debug thing here in a browser. You can use console statements in JavaScript to debug and to troubleshoot your code. Let's go back to this example and let's add a new function to kind of keep things tidy here. So here we now have a function called create h1, and we are doing the exact same thing we were doing before. We're setting a body to match the body in the DOM, same with the header. We're then attaching to the header a text content that says welcome page, and we are appending that header to the body as a child. And now that this is all inside of a function, we can call that function on load. So if I refresh, we see the exact same thing that we saw before, but it's now happening a little more dynamically. So let's now try adding a second function, one where we create containers. So let's call this one create container. And let's say body will equal query selector body. And we're also going to pull up the div element. And then we want to specify container as the ID of our div. And we then want to set some styles. So like we saw in the CSS, we had styles for the items inside of this code block. We could do the same thing in JavaScript. So for the display, we are going to set the display to grid. And we are also going to specify the number of columns and the number of rows. And then we want to append this div. Whoops, that is not what we want. We just want body. So now let's add this function to our onload method. And let's refresh. Nothing happens. But if we look inside of our inspector, we could see that we do have our style set. Actually, let me just make sure that we are not using the CSS. Let's refresh. Yep, we still have our style set to have a display of grid with our columns defined. And if we are to add some entries, then we could actually see these results. So let's now create a new function called create boxes. So now we're going to create the individual boxes. Now let's say document.query selector will equal, we're going to use the hash to reference an ID, an element through its ID, I should say. And then we are going to iterate through a list of these containers. So let's see. Let div equal document.create element div. So every time we iterate through this array, we are going to create an element called div. We are going to set the background color to, let's just say, aquamarine. And let's save that for now. And let's then remember we have to append the child. And let's just also add some text. And for this text, we're going to dynamically render the index using the variable that we set within our for loop. So let's save this. Let's add create boxes to our onload method and let's refresh. Cool. Let's inspect this. If we inspect this, we could see each individual cell is an element, a div element with a style set to having a background color of aquamarine. And we could also see that all of these child divs have been appended to a parent div with an ID of container. Any questions about this so far? Cool. To add a few more lines just to make it a little prettier. And we have pretty much what we had with the styles.css. So let's see. Now we want to try adding some animations, like when we had the hover CSS block, except we're going to do it through JavaScript. So let's do a function where we change the color. But how this is going to work in JavaScript is we have to utilize events and listeners. An event is basically any kind of interaction that the user is going to have with the browser. So clicking, for example, is an event. Onload is an event. That's an event that's called when you load the page. And we utilize event listeners, which basically wait for an event to trigger before they execute some code. So let's write a new function. Let's call it create color change listener. And let's say, again, we're going to select the element that we want to target. It's, in this case, it's going to be a div with an ID of container. And then we want to add an event listener. So let's use the add event listener function. And I'm not sure which extension this is, but we could read about how add event listener works through this nifty little pop-up. So we're adding the add event listener and we are passing in click as the kind of event that we're looking for. And then we're going to use an anonymous function where we pass in the event to the behavior we want to execute. So in this case, we're going to select a random color and we're going to use math.floor. You should have seen this before at some point in the curriculum. You might have used it in a previous challenge, but math.floor and math.random will allow us to randomize a number within a certain range. And we are going to change this to a string. Then we are going to say target style background color equals plus random color. Let's now call this function. And let's see if it works. Cool. Now, when we click on an item, we have a random color. Any questions about this code block?
Yeah, in line 36, what's the hashtag mean?
Sure. The hashtag is used to denote the hexadecimal value of a color. So if we look at some of the styling in the style sheet and we look at these colors, we see that they're pre-written, right? But we could also use hexadecimal values as opposed to, like, let's say a letter. And yeah, hexadecimal best value basically consists of a 6-digit number, right? And well, a better way of saying it, actually, it's 3 pairs of, yeah, it's 3 pairs of 2 digits. So let's say 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. This equals black, because this is essentially an RGB value. If I refresh this, we'll see black. And then if we were to lighten this, let's say, let's do 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, it's gonna look like a gray. Somewhat like a gray. Let's make it a little lighter. So this 6-digit hexadecimal value consists of pairs of integers that basically, I shouldn't even say integers, I just say characters, pairs of characters that will specify the red, green, and blue values of a color. So the first pair is always red, the second pair is always blue. If we wanted red, for example, we could type 9900 for blue and 00 for green, and we will get a reddish color. Now, I corrected myself earlier saying I want to say characters instead of integers, because these hexadecimal values don't just range from 0 to 9. They range from 0 to F, because values A, B, C, D, E, and F are actually representations of, so if we say FF, for example, this is essentially 16. We're giving the red a value of 16. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, I see now that, okay, so the random number, and then you're just adding that hashtag to make it a color. That makes, I was just kind of thrown off by that, but yep. Thank you.
Right on. Yeah, hexadecimal values, oh, now might actually be a good time to add this challenge, but hexadecimal values are pretty cool. There is if you, once you get to the point where like you're doing your own styling for some of your challenges and whatnot, it's a pretty easy way of like kind of remembering how to just know off the top of your head how to color something, right? Because you might not know exactly what color you want, but you could say, I want a bluish color. You could just kind of use your knowledge of mixing colors to say, well, let's use another example. Let's say purple. You make purple from red, right? So I could just say, or I want to actually, let's do a yellow green. So to do a yellow green, no, let's stick with purple. We're gonna stick with purple for now. So we're gonna combine red and blue for purple. So let's just say I don't know, 999900. This should give us a purple. Does anyone know what I did wrong?
It's red, green, blue. So the last two I think need to be.
Exactly. So let's replace that with that, and let's refresh, and now we have a nice purplish color. So just understanding hexadecimal values, you could kind of use this to just create colors on the go without having to go like look up a hexadecimal value, for example, to get the specific color you want.
I think that's the right thing to do.
I mean, could also do this, of course, if you want a very specific value. And there are extensions inside of Visual Studio that will allow you to do this. I always kind of forget which extension it is, and my different workspaces have like different extensions enabled. But yeah, there is an extension where basically if you have it enabled, you could click on a hexadecimal value and it will pop up a color picker for you to play around with, and I'll give you the exact value that you want. Let's see. So that's using event listeners to modify the style of an element on the fly. We could see that we're still able to randomly change these colors by clicking. And I think that's about it for the demonstration. I think if any part of the demo is unclear to you, feel free to run through the demo on your own. It's just the README from today's lesson. Otherwise, you can jump straight into the challenge after taking a break. How does that sound?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So I was just messing around with it myself, and the background, the container itself will change colors as well. Is there a way to make it so just the children would respond to that click?
Hold on. In my instance, it's only the child that's changing, but for you, you're seeing everything changes when you click.
If you click in between in the white space, the container changes as
Oh.
well.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And you were wondering,
How to make it so it's just the children and not the container?
oh, okay. Yeah, let's see. Let's see. How do we have our function written right now? Our create color change listener says to select our container element, and we basically add a listener to oh, okay, so we're adding the event listener to the container. Instead of adding it to the container, let's try setting a new variable called child box or something, I don't know. And we're going to use the query selector to now select an ID. So if we look back to where we're creating our boxes, we're setting a for loop where we create child elements and we are setting a text content to I, but we're not setting, for example, a class name. So well, let's set a class name. Let's just call it, I don't know. Div dot class name equals, I don't know, child box. And if we set our query selector to look specifically for child box using period to denote that it's a class, then we should be able to attach this event listener to the child box specifically. And let's see, so far it's not working. So we have a class name of child box. I wonder if we're unable to use query selector for, oh, I'm missing a T here. Save, let's refresh. Still not working. Instead of, let's try setting the ID, the child box. Might not like that. Right, what am I missing? So we've selected the container, and within the container, we're creating a bunch of children. We're setting the ID to child box. If we look inside our inspector, we have an ID set to child box, and our create color change listener is caching the child box. I wonder if we're unable to. Oh. Let me refresh again. Each child box should have an event listener that allows us to click on it to change its color. But I wonder
You
if,
have to get element by ID, don't you? If you're accessing an ID,
sorry, what was that?
I think you have to access the ID instead of query selector. Get element by ID.
Oh, okay, get element by ID. So,
On child box.
are you saying to,
Yeah, maybe. Well, that would have been cool.
the query selector should allow us to, returns the first element that is a descendant of the node. Okay, but it's not even,
Is it maybe because container has equal weight, so it's not able to override it with the, I mean, I'm thinking like ID class weight. You know what I mean in CSS? Does that make sense?
the CSS should all be, I'm not, sorry, say that one more time.
So maybe I'm thinking like container is set to that color
Mhm.
and it has a certain weight in CSS. So maybe if container were a class instead, and then child box were an ID.
Okay. Let's see, so let's, this is the class name. Let's use that.
Nice.
Cool. But right, it's only returning it for the first one because query selector only selects the first one. So what if we try get element by ID? Let's refresh. Unfortunately, doesn't work. What could we do to be able to do this for all of them?
If you use get element by ID, do you need to remove that hashtag from the child box?
Let's see. It's still returning the first one. So returns a reference of the first object with a specified value. Okay, so it's still the first object. I'm thinking if we try a class name, it might work. It might not though. But yeah, let's try it. Let's say for child box, we're gonna set up class name instead of ID. It's still only doing it for the first one.
Is there a difference between query selector and query selector all?
Ooh, that's a good question. Query selector all. What does this do? Returns all element descendants of node that matches the selectors. Okay. Returns all element descendants. Let's change this back to an ID because the class didn't work. And it does not seem to like that. So trying to assign an event listener to what must be an array of elements doesn't seem to trigger the event properly. I would like to, yeah, while you guys are running through this, let's see if anyone can figure out how to get Matt's question to work, and we'll see if anyone can demo it later on tonight. How does that sound? Cool. I'm gonna set out breakout rooms, take a break, and we will reconvene at 9 o'clock to go over this and the guessing number challenge.